I said I'm going to mention the word risk 200 and some times, so I'm going to mention it again. But now I'm going to mention it in a different context than I've mentioned it previously. And still on the subject of risk assessment, here it's risk in terms of should the state do a procurement at all? Basically, to do or not to do. So, do we want to contract? And when you ask for the, should you do the procurement, because this is part of what you're supposed to assess in terms of what is the assignment, it's what are you trying to solve, etc., and will a contract, in your best estimation, get you there? Versus, no, it's not going to do any good, it's going to waste time and effort and still not solve it anyway. So we're going to look at a couple aspects, and then we're going to give you a couple examples to illustrate this. Can the problem be isolated and identified? So what is the problem? Can you identify the problem? Obviously, it's hard to solve something if you can't figure out what it is you're trying to solve. And can specifications reasonably be drafted to accomplish the intended goal? And that may sound simple, like sure, but we're going to have an exercise probably within an hour where I'm going to ask you for a specific circumstance of can you come up with specifications to solve the problem? Is there adequate time? And this is one that frequently comes into play, probably more so than the first two. Number one, is there time to do the procurement properly? Because lots of times you have agency people submit things and they want an award and they say 2.5 months, 3 months, something like that, where you know the only way to meet that time frame is doing the very minimum allowable time frame for every step, when that isn't going to happen. And the other thing that happens, and a lot of this was covered in the overview class, if any of you took that, was lots of times we try to compensate by taking more time than expected in the procurement by giving the vendor less time for startup of a contract. We award it today, we want you to start tomorrow. Well, yes, you have to hire 50 people to do it, but can't you hire 50 people between today and tomorrow? So those are issues to look at from the standpoint of if you don't have time to do it right, perhaps you shouldn't do it at all. A project schedule should be created to properly plot all time frames so the adequacy of time can be determined. Lay it out. Actually look at it visually. Sometimes something that seems rational. Oh, we have 180 days to do this. But then when you start doing it step by step and looking at what you think is going to be involved in every step, maybe that time frame doesn't seem adequate once you put all the pieces inside it. Has a competent estimate been made of the cost? Do you think it's going to cost $1 million, $5 million, $10 million? And if the budget is $1,500 per person, is that reasonable? Is there any basis to expect that $1,500 per person to go to Kenya is a reasonable estimate? So maybe before you go ahead and embark on a procurement, you go back to budget to find out, is there any potential of getting more money? Or just what can you do if you don't think you have enough money to begin with? Maybe you don't go to Kenya. Maybe you go somewhere else. Maybe you don't do anything. Are there sufficient funds? That's the same thing. What is the cost-benefit ratio? We'll talk about that a little later, about cost-benefit, and total cost of ownership we will talk about a little later also. So these are aspects of risk assessment. Now here's something that most of you don't think about because it doesn't come into play for most procurement. But is there an opponent to what you're going to do? And in about 10 minutes we're going to give you an example of where there was an opponent that basically caused a procurement to fail. If there's an opponent, are they vocal? Are they influential? And the key thing is something we've said lots of times, probably not in this class, but how's it going to read in the Sun papers? Or wherever you are, whatever paper you have. Another issue, and this came up, well, comes up sometimes. We had to, when we did the consolidation of the food service at Eastern Shore. If you have employees doing a service currently, and your assignment is to go out and do a procurement to do what state employees currently do on state premises, there's a law that says that in order for you to be able to contract, you have to save at least 20% over the cost of doing it with state employees, or if the cost is over $1 million, you have to save at least $200,000. And there's rules that go into play, how you calculate the cost of employees, what has to be imputed in the cost of the contractor to make the comparison, what kind of notice has to be given to the employees, what kind of notice has to be given to the bargaining unit for the employees, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a consideration if you're thinking about outsourcing something that hasn't been outsourced before. And this is the last one I want to really emphasize. Are there adequate resources and resolve to properly manage the contract? This is one of the biggest failings in not state procurement per se, but state contracting. We may spend a lot more effort writing specifications and doing the procurement than we spend making sure the vendor does the contract after they win the award. And that's, to a degree, that's kind of the reverse of what should happen. Because when the contract is awarded, that's when you're getting the delivery of what you've done the procurement for. And if you don't pay attention to what the contractor's doing, the contractor's going to know you're not paying attention to what they're doing. And some contractors will go in with the intent to try to get away with as much as they can. Other contractors may not go in with that intent, but it's kind of human nature that if you see no one's watching you, maybe there's a time when there's a time crunch by the vendor. And so, well, maybe I can get away with not doing this particular thing at this particular time. And so they don't do something and no one says a word. And so maybe the next time they do something else. And over the course of several years, maybe they end up that they have a significant shortfall between what they contracted to do and what they're performing. But usually there's not a shortfall between what they're getting paid versus what they were originally to be paid to do. So one of the things that we need to do a better job of in planning is the whole aspect of how are you going to make sure you manage it. And if you don't have the plan to manage it, if you don't have the resolve to manage it, I will go so far as to say maybe you shouldn't do it at all. If you don't manage it, don't do it. Conversely, if you do it, manage it. Do you want to say any words to that?
The worst thing that we do in state government contracting-wise is...
I have to stand next to him.
The one thing we do worse, in my opinion, is that we do not manage contracts properly. It is just, you know, and there's reasons for it. I mean, it's difficult. It's time-consuming. It's not your primary job. The vendors are smarter than we are on what it is that they're doing. So they give you a bill and it shows a certain number of hours, and how are you going to confirm that the people were working those number of hours? They say they did X pieces of work and you pay them on a piece basis. Well, you know, to check that, you got to go back into the system. You got to get your IT guy to look at something or issue a report. Yeah, it's been this way every month. It's pretty similar. It's okay. I'll sign off on it. We just do not do good contract management, and it comes back to bite us. It comes back because the vendor then says, well, this is the way we've always been doing it. You've been paying our bills this way. You know, why are you making a big deal about it now? You should have told us when we started, or shortly thereafter. We let things, and then when we do discover a deficiency, we don't act on it quickly enough. We may act on it and say, I think your billing's off by $2,000. Okay, let me take a look at it. And he comes back, he says, yeah, billing's off by $1,800, and we'll make that correction on the next bill. Well, who's to watch the next bill if you're not there? Or if someone else has been assigned the contractor, you've got a new job. The communications or the lack of it really hurts us. We had one example where a vendor was saying that they were doing a particular job and we had no way of saying, no, you didn't do that particular job. They were billing the way they were supposed to be billing. And then it wound up being part of a report that went to a national agency. When it got to the national agency level, it was compared against, Maryland was compared against other states, and somebody scratched their head and said, how could you have these kinds of results? You know, what's going on, Maryland? Well, it took a lot of time, a lot of effort by people here in Maryland to find out that the vendor had a bad egg in their establishment who was falsifying results in order to get the work done. And believe me, it took a lot of time, a lot of effort. It was not pleasant for anybody. So that's why we have to manage contracts from the beginning. When there's a problem, you know, it's like balancing your checkbook. You know, you're out 2 cents. Find the 2 cents, because it may not be 2 cents. It may be $8.02. You know, it's just something that tips you off.
Isn't that part of the responsibility, or the responsibility of the contract monitor, or does the procurement person work with the contract monitor both to manage the contract? How are you?
It's a good question. Procurement is out of it once it becomes a contract.
Okay.
Then it's up to the project manager or the contract monitor to handle it. We get back in the situation when there's an impasse and when there's a problem and when it's necessary to talk to the vendor about cancellation for cause. No vendor, no good vendor wants to be canceled for cause. It's a black eye. If they're a public company, it causes them other kinds of problems. But that's when we get back involved, and when your AAG gets involved. So we try to avoid those, but it happens. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
A lot of times we get involved when it's time for renewals and when it's time for options and when it's time to get a new contract. That's when we find out that things have happened during that year that OPAS wants answers, DBM wants answers, but we don't know until it's time to renew the contract or have the option to renew.
Well,
Restate the question.
I'm not sure of the question, but I know the comment. The comment is when it comes time to renew an option or to exercise an option or to modify a contract, that's when the program doesn't, that's when the program realizes that they have to provide certain additional material to OPAS and or DBM. Is that the comment? So some things have been added to that process, such as you really have to start earlier in the renewal process or the option exercise process because we want you now to ask vendors if they will voluntarily reduce their price. And believe it or not, DHMH has been very successful in that regard. And I don't know how long it's going to continue, but we've gotten some very nice, reasonable reductions from vendors. The option for us is that we go and do a resolicitation. And the vendor who has the option really doesn't want to see that happen. It's more work for them. We don't want to see it happen either because it's more work for us, and we don't know what the pricing necessarily is at that particular time, although we do not have to accept the pricing for a resolicitation, I don't think, if the old one is better. But it's a lot of effort and it's a lot of work. So oftentimes a vendor will give some small price concession. The other things are, a lot of the stuff also relates to minority business usage. And the minority business doesn't get looked at over the course of the contract very often. It gets looked at when the contract's going up for renewal. And someone will say, well, these guys were supposed to do 25%, they're doing 4%, you know, what's going on? And there may be good, logical reasons for it, but that all has to be approved in the procurement review group process. So you got to start earlier in the renewals and modification process. So that's a very good point. The point is that what involvement does procurement have initially to try to get good contract management after we're not involved? And Joel had developed a form for their solicitations. We at OPAS have changed it. We're now asking that it be used with every IFB and RFP. I've got the forms here. As soon as I get done talking or answering a couple more questions, I'm going to pass it out for you to see. It was something we were holding until later or tomorrow. But do you have any comments about
the form
the
or
use
the
of a form?
Well, I created it, so I think it should be used. I can give you perhaps some more observation on the subject of contract management. We've made these generalizations. That is typically something that's highly, not very well done for the most part in the state. And you can look at it two ways. It's out of procurement's hands, there's nothing procurement can do about it, or you can look at it another way. In the planning, first thing, you can ask who's going to be the contract manager, and you can help try to make sure the contract manager participates in the procurement process, but you can do other things. Procurement method by itself. Sometimes you look at what is the likelihood of management versus doing a procurement one way versus another. And I'll give you an example. We have another agency we're dealing with for a procurement currently that they're doing something as a cost reimbursement contract. Cost reimbursement means whatever the vendor costs to do something, that's what they get paid. There's some parameters, but for the most part, if they have an expense, we pay for it. The obligation is that if there's cost reimbursement, there is actually supposed to be a certification by the procurement officer that there is going to be adequate contract management on the part of the state to undertake a cost reimbursement contract. In this particular instance, the agency was doing cost reimbursement with the only thing they said is we reserve the right to ask you to submit expense accounts or expense information to us, and then never did it. So there was no monitoring, no validation of the vendor's price. One of the things we said is structure in the solicitation the next time a requirement for a periodic audit by another entity. If you can't do it yourself, have it in there, then DBM has an audit contract, an audit master contract that you can come and do a task order and get an auditor to go out and basically monitor your contract for you. And yes, it's going to cost some money, but is that money better spent than risking that the vendor is going to get paid and not produce what they're supposed to pay? So there are things that you can do to help embellish on the fact of management. As I said, fixed price, cost reimbursement, various other elements. And in the perform class in particular, not to threaten you or anything, but there's 914 slides in perform, and the whole perform class is on this type of issue. What do you build in the specifications to begin with? What can you do as considerations that help make management easier? You can specify surveys. You can specify focus groups. You can specify all kinds of things that will help you with management. But you have to think of it, and usually what you say to yourself is, do I have the internal resources to manage? And if I don't, let's do something else that can substitute for the lack of internal resources. So.
Was there another question?
I had a comment.
Yes, ma'am.
I think what sometimes the procurement staff don't understand is we get, especially in Medicaid, we get these mandates from the federal government. You will do this by such and such a date. We don't get money. We don't get people. We just get the mandate. So we've got to make a contract. We've got to procure this service. You know, and it's already overburdened program staff writing the RFP and evaluating the RFP, and there really aren't people to monitor.
In the situation you said, when you have a federal mandate, obviously if a federal mandate, If you don't meet that mandate, presumably you lose money. You lose some kind of federal funding. Maybe the answer is,
Licensing,
pardon me?
or you lose licensing.
There's some ramification, yes. Maybe the answer is that you get outside help to right you with doing it. There's only, as all of you know, you have finite capability to do things. And you can only do what you can do. And if there's something beyond that that's necessary, sometimes you have to go out and get additional resources. And sometimes that means you pay a vendor to help you.
I want to know about these contracts because they're the ones, if I were back in private business, I'd love to have one of those contracts.
And the answer might be if you have a particular circumstance that you have a lot of money at risk, maybe you have justification for an emergency, to award an emergency contract to do something. If you have situations, you would first go to Gary, discuss it with him, and then whatever he thinks is the best solution, sometimes he comes to us and discusses with us, and we can decide, in that given situation, what should you do? We don't have all the answers, but hopefully sometime we have some of the answers. Okay, so you've had a preview of the Perform class and the stuff that you're going to get into if you take Perform, which is coming up. At some point you'll want to give them the dates. We're going to do that in November and December, 5 days of Perform. So I'm going to continue second week or so in November, going into the second week or so of December for those 5 days of Perform. But moving on, that was just an editorial to try to get some interest in the other class. Will the contractor have to incur excessive risk to undertake? We've talked about that. Is the good or service cutting edge? And again, we're going to give you an example of this. Will being awarded this contract impair the contractor's ability to obtain subsequent contracts? There is a prohibition in the state ethics law of a vendor assisting with specifications for a procurement. So there are some circumstances that if a vendor does do work for a state agency to come up with specifications, they are not allowed to try to get the subsequent award of the other part of it. And I'll explain that in a moment. But that's a risk to a vendor. If I have a choice of going after one part of the project or another part of the project, which one do I want to go after? Well, usually the larger one, which usually isn't the front end. What is the potential liability to the state as a result of contracting? And this is not something that happens much anymore, but the state has sovereign immunity, at least partial sovereign immunity, so sometimes the state has less risk of doing something itself than if they contract, because a contractor does not have sovereign immunity. So it just happens sometimes. Will completing a normal procurement contract yield what is wanted? And here are some alternatives to doing a procurement. And these are things often you think about. Do the project with state personnel. I mean, usually that's the first thing we do think about. And let's see, we've lost, 3,000 positions in the past 2 or 3 years through the state as a whole. So usually there's not state personnel. But I will throw out one example that just happened. State Highway Administration had a procurement for maintaining one of the rest stops along the highway. And they did a procurement, and the incumbent didn't win, and they filed a protest. Normally, under that circumstance, you do an extension with the incumbent to have them keep doing the work while the protest goes its way through the whole process. In this instance, State Highway Administration decided, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to reward them for filing the protest. So they took their staff that would be doing other things and just had them start cleaning the rest stop, etc., doing what was necessary until such time as the protest is resolved. So they are doing that currently with state personnel. When the protest is resolved, it'll go back under contract. Do an intra or interagency agreement, an MOU, and many of you are familiar with going, I think, principally University of Maryland, Baltimore, UMBC, etc. Lots of you are well familiar with how do I avoid doing a procurement? What can I do to get what I need other than a procurement? And there's nothing wrong with that. If you can get what you need really through an alternative means that gets what you want at a reasonable price, fine. Most of the time you can't, but you can at least try it. Third one, use an existing statewide contract. As I said, DBM, we have a contract for auditing services. We have a contract for foreign language interpretation. We have a contract, we did have a contract for management analysis, management consulting. We are going to have a contract probably within the next 6 months for sign language interpretation and interpretation for people with what they call visual communication rather than hearing communication. So there are master contracts. DGS has master contracts. Information technology has master contracts. Lots of times you can use that as an alternative to doing a procurement yourself. You just have to know they're there and see the degree to which you can utilize them. Yes?
Who's usually involved in developing statewide contracts?
What was that again?
Who is usually involved in developing the statewide contract?
Statewide contract, it depends on the activity. If it's information technology, it would be Do It. If it is a service, it would be us. If it is a commodity, it would be General Services.
The only reason I ask, there's a recent requirement by the Joint Commission that each facility have pharmaceutical hazardous waste, rather than flushing it down the toilet, it be collected, and we have a service provided that they take away the pills or whatever, the containers that are holding the pills, et cetera, taken away and be incinerated and whatnot.
Okay?
I'm just wondering if anything has been in the process to do a statewide contract for that.
I can guarantee you.
Every facility here, I believe, is under that requirement, and I haven't heard a thing about it. And we're developing an RFP, but I would just think that under that circumstance, a statewide contract would make sense.
Okay?
Can I just address that?
You may indeed.
A statewide contract may indeed make sense, but what I would look at first is the county hospital in your jurisdiction and what they are doing to see if you could piggyback on their contract, because that's already been done. You know whether the vendor is satisfactory or not. There are economies of scale. Instead of trying to get multiple vendors in a statewide contract, or one vendor who now has to travel to 14 facilities, I'm willing to bet that there are a number of facilities in your area. It doesn't have to be in the county, it just has to be in your area, that you could get perhaps use a cooperative contract.
When you say county hospital, what do you mean by that?
You can do an intergovernmental, DBM can do an intergovernmental contract on our behalf. So if your county facility has entered into a hazardous waste disposal contract with Waste Management, that contract might be able to be used by your facility without going through a procurement.
All right.
But now let's get the
Yes.
better answer.
The first issue is to be able to use that, and that's that's the last bullet up there. Piggyback with other governments on an intergovernmental cooperative purchase. First issue is it has to be a government that did that procurement. If you're talking about hospitals, most hospitals are private nonprofit organizations, not governments. And if they are a private nonprofit organization, you cannot use that procedure because it must be a government. Now, maybe as an interim procedure until there's a procurement, maybe you can contract with them as a sole source for them to take your stuff as well and use their contract. But from what you're saying, and I heard something about this before, but I'm hearing more about it now than I have even prior to this. It may make sense to do a department-wide, because I don't know how many places in the state actually have this requirement. Your facilities have it, juvenile service facilities would have it, the prison facilities would have it. I'm not sure where else.
MHA, DDA, I would imagine.
That's all DHMH.
Yeah.
I said corrections. Because, well, corrections actually has a pharmacy contract where that is a requirement of the pharmacy contractor to do that. That anything that's out of stock or anything like that, the pharmacy contractor has to take it back and has to dispose of it properly. So they already have their requirements met through that contract.
That's pharmaceuticals, not necessarily all hazardous waste.
Right. I'm talking about pharmaceuticals. because that's what I thought I heard you say, pills and things like that. But if hazardous waste, I know there was a contract for labs administration for hazardous waste. I don't know whether it's anything beyond that or whether there still is a contract for labs administration. But, all right, so your suggestion is that there be a statewide contract for that. Okay. Well, I'll take it under consideration. And what that means is, do I have the people to do it? No. So. But at least I know it's something that exists, and maybe I can discuss with Gary if there's some other way to do it in the interim. Okay. And that's the kind of thing that there very likely might be another government that already has done a procurement for that. And one of the first things that happens is someone does an internet search for keywords, hazardous waste disposal, something like that, and just sees what kind of hits they have. And if you can find that Fairfax, Virginia, or the state of Pennsylvania, or any governmental entity, it could be a public college or university, has a contract to do hazardous waste disposal and has what we call the magic words. The magic words means a clause that extends the use of that contract to other governments. So they're saying it's not just us that's doing the procurement that can use this, but other governments can use it as well. If you have a government that has the contract that does what you want and has the magic words, then if it's a service, we, DBM, can permit you to simply go and use the vendor who has that contract as if you had done your own procurement. That saves a whole lot of time and effort. And usually, you also get lower prices because someone has already given a price to one government based upon serving more than that one government. So that's one of the ways that you can avoid doing a procurement. Just, is there someplace else? We had someone come to us a couple weeks ago that wanted to know if we could do a contract to get grant writers. First thing we did was go on the internet and found out that there's like 5 universities throughout the country, public universities that have these type of contracts. There's other states that have these type of contracts. So we're going to see if we can use one of those other governments rather than doing a procurement. So we don't do a procurement if we don't have to.
2 other things I was thinking about with the piggybacking thing. One was University of Maryland Medical Systems.
Okay.
That probably has a hazardous waste or should have a hazardous waste.
They don't.
Well, they're disposing of it, so I'll make the call and find out how they're doing that.
Well, do they have their own incinerator? Because some of these places have their own incineration. If that's even permissible anymore, I don't know.
This is all a very new requirement, so in fact, T&T, which I can't remember what the initial stands for, they're having a meeting in November to discuss this issue. So everyone's
Okay.
struggling.
And then the other one would be the OCME from our standpoint, and labs.
Okay. But we'll look at it. I'm not offering any great hope, but we'll look at it. Mike in the back's not volunteering to do it. Mike works for me. I saw him raise his hand. I want that. Yes, please, let me do it. Another thing you can try to do, going to the one above that, is try to get a preferred provider. Maryland Correctional Enterprises, Blind Industries and Services of Maryland, or community service organization, or individual with disability-owned business. And I'm not saying this is something that you perhaps frequently can take advantage of, but I will say something just within the past month. Department of Assessments and Taxation, which is just over in 301 West Preston, went to a community service provider, and there was something that they were doing with their own staff that they, in conjunction with this community service provider, wanted to know whether this vendor could start doing this activity. And they worked up a 6-month pilot contract for this vendor to try to do it, try to learn it, and then they would assess after 6 months whether it was successful. And because it is a community service provider, it is a preferred provider, do not have to have any competition to go to a preferred provider. In fact, you're supposed to go to preferred providers. And so they simply got the contract awarded with the community-based organization. And 6 months later, if the thing's successful, they'll do a multi-year contract with this community service organization without doing a procurement. So at least these are things you can explore before you automatically go out and do a procurement.
Excuse me. I wanted to ask you about that MCE and preferred provider.
Yes.
Recently, I had a choice to give a assignment to MCE for mailing 10,000 letters.
Okay?
They took the job. They were lower than the University of Maryland, so we gave them the job. The deadline was supposed to be like within a week to mail out everything. They were late by about 4 or 5 days. Every time I called them, they kept saying, "Oh, it's going to be done tomorrow. It's going to be done tomorrow." Is there any recourse that we have that we can call, ask them? I asked them by email to give me some discount now because you have gone over the limit that I had provided to you. So is there any way that you can ask for any recourse?
All right, I have to repeat what he's saying. He used Maryland Correctional Enterprises for mailing activities where he told them what had to be mailed and the time frame in particular by which it had to be mailed, and they didn't meet the time frame.
Right.
And what you're asking is, well, you agreed to a price meeting your time frame. Do you have the right to not pay them since they didn't, at least some discount for not meeting the time frame? I would think that if you say you've asked them for that and they haven't told you they'll give you one?
They said the lady I've been working with, she said, I'm checking with my manager.
Okay.
So they haven't come back to me.
My suggestion is you check with her manager. I have two suggestions. First of all the preferred provider programs are administered by General Services. So if you have a complaint, whether it's with Maryland Correctional Enterprises, Blind Industries or Services, community-based organization, and you can't get satisfaction from the organization itself, you can complain to probably Mike Hafley at DGS.
General Service.
And hopefully, if you have a valid case, they will come in on your side to try to get that. But the other thing I would say is hopefully, if you have presented this to them, they would give you that discount. I mean, they come to our senior procurement meetings. Usually all three of these organizations come every other month. And they're there available to answer questions. And if someone says to them, you're not doing the job, they probably right then and there would say, all right, we'll give you a credit or something like that.
Let me add to that. You must use MCE if they can provide what it is that you want in the time frame that you need. Okay? And if time is critical to you, you should write into your agreement the same as you would do for any other contractor, and that is that if these things are not posted by X date, they will refund X dollars, right? So there's no beforehand, yeah. So there's no dispute. Now, I also believe that you've got the right to treat any preferred provider with the same issue of responsibility. So if tomorrow you had another one and they messed you up on this one, I think responsibility becomes an issue. And if you ask them for a waiver, I would ask it based upon their poor performance in the previous situation. And if they don't want to give you a waiver, certainly build in those penalties to it. If they don't want to sign that, see your AAG.
Well, if they won't give you a waiver, then you go to DGS and you explain why you think that the vendor, even though they say they can do this, here's the evidence of why they haven't done it before. Now, if you can get some kind of assurance that you can believe that that was an aberration and it won't happen that way again, they will meet the deadline the next time, then maybe you are okay with not getting a waiver and giving it to them. But if there's no more assurance, you go to DGS because DGS can allow you not to use a preferred provider.
And one more comment about MCE. They have to have value added, okay? We had a situation not too long ago where one of the facilities needed hospital beds. And it became a real difficult situation because for some reason, a vendor from North Carolina was calling the facility, showing them the different hospital beds that they had to offer, and it was going to be offered through MCE. MCE is not a broker. They are not, we do not buy from MCE to have them pass something through. At one time, they did have a mattress shop. I looked into that. But it's been inactive, maybe it's active now, I don't know. But they've got to, and the same thing with Blind Industries, they've got to add value to whatever it is that you're looking to seek, to get.
We find at times that they're a little lackadaisical in getting things back to you with dates that they promise. And we don't know if it's because, and no pun intended, that they have so much time on their hands, the staff. But how do you guarantee, you have to consistently put those specifications in there to guarantee that you're going to get things back as expected.
Well, if you were giving a copy job to Staples, right, you'd put specifications in there. MCE's challenge often is labor, and it's not necessarily that they have too much time on their hands. It's that they don't have enough of the right trained talent to be able to put onto some of the jobs. So it's not necessarily that they have all these people available at 15 cents an hour or whatever they pay. It's that they want to get the job done correctly too. The OCME is still waiting for furniture. Their building opened weeks ago. They're still waiting for furniture from MCE. So it's not a perfect situation. It is the law. And to the extent that we can, we should and need to use them.
But again, you go back to them, you should escalate. Like in the overview class, in 3 of the slides, we give contact people for Blind Industries, Maryland Correctional Enterprises, and the community service organizations. And basically, not someone at the bottom, but someone at the top. In a couple instances, it is the very head of the organization. Here's their email address, here's their phone number, and what they say at our senior procurement meetings is, if you have issues, let us hear about it. And at those senior procurement meetings, nobody says anything. No, so if you have issues, since Gary attends that, next one will be in November, you can let Gary know your issues, and the next time they say, anybody have a problem? Gary's usually not hesitant to speak up. But these are alternatives to doing procurements. You could decide these are some other alternatives. Maybe you do regulations. Now, something Gary just asked me about today is, can a contract be extended rather than re-procured because the agency is seeking to promulgate regulations that will take it out of the realm of procurement? And if we're going to have regulations, if we anticipate having regulations in place in like 6 months, what's the point in doing a procurement that's going to take 3 months or 4 months to do, that's going to be in place for 2 months, and then you go to regulations? So sometimes regulation is the panacea for not doing a procurement. Sometimes you can get something approved as a grant. A grant is mutually exclusive from a procurement, so if you can get it as a grant, it's not a procurement. Or a combination of the above, or the last one there of those bullets. Do not proceed with the project, which in a couple minutes we're going to tell you about a situation where we didn't proceed with a project. It's better to recognize early on that something is not likely to work than to spend lots of time and money only to ultimately reach that conclusion. So this is part of your due diligence when you're undertaking what is your assignment. Should your assignment be, don't do it? Doesn't happen usually that that's the answer, but it's at least something you should look at. And we're going to start with example number 1. So we talked about when a procurement was not completed, i.e. no award, because of avowed opposition from an influential party. Canceled due to strong opposition. June 2001. So let me go back a little further. Around 2000, when the contract for the operation of payphones in the prison was coming up for the new procurement, because this was considered to be information technology. And because at that time DBM had both information technology and services, we did the procurement for payphones in the prison because it's information technology. And when we started meeting with the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services about the specifications for this recompetition, they let us know that there was this little organization out there that had some really vocal individual who kind of created this organization that kept writing letters to legislators and kept writing letters to the Secretary of Public Safety and kept complaining that this contract shouldn't exist because it was taking advantage of not the inmates, but the families of the inmates in the prison, as I'm going to explain in the slides. And so because we knew that there was this static out there that did not think this was even something proper to procure, we said to public safety, are you sure you want to do this again the way you've done this before? And that means where there's a commission-based situation where the vendor who operates the payphones does not get paid by the state. Instead, they get paid by the people who make the calls, and they pay a commission to public safety for the right to be in the public safety locations. So because of this vocal individual and his little organization, do you want to keep doing the new procurement the same way? And the answer was that the state, this was another one of the times when the state had a fiscal challenge. And the answer was, we need money, all the money we can get. So yes, we want to keep doing it on a commission basis. So we, with public safety, did the specifications, put out a procurement. And let me go forward a little bit and give you some more background. Let's see. The result of our procurement, the second bullet up there, was that the result from that particular procurement was that at that time, the state public safety was getting about a 50% commission. So of every 10 cents, if you will, that was paid on for a call, 5 cents went to public safety. And our result was that the commission was going from 50% to over 60%, which meant the state was going to make more money from that procurement, but at the same time, the cost was going to decrease to the people who would be receiving the calls. And I'm going to flash back now to give you some background after this. We thought we had done a really good job. You know, we broke our arms patting ourselves on the shoulder. Less cost, more revenue. What's wrong about that? So now we flash back. We're at May 2001. We submitted an item to the Board of Public Works to approve this contract with this good news story. We not only are getting more revenue for the state, but it's going to cost the end recipient less money at the same time there's more money going to the state. Good news, good deal. Who could ask any questions about a situation like that? And lo and behold, the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties, to answer my own question, who could protest that type of situation? The NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, the same prisoner advocacy group, and 3 or 4 or 5 state legislators all started writing to the members of the Board of Public Works, the Secretary of Public Safety, the Secretary of Budget and Management, all saying this was not something that should be awarded. And then, somewhere in here, I say, well, regardless of where the slide is, then the Sun paper picked up on it. So one of these entities contacted the Sun paper about this situation. So then one day, before the Board of Public Works actually voted on the submission, you pick up the Morning Sun paper and there's this headline about, in so many words, how the state is gouging the families of prisoners just to make a few bucks. And the next thing that happened was we were instructed by the Board of Public Works to withdraw the item because they did not want to vote on this item to gouge the families of the prisoners. And so we had this good result, more revenue, less expense, and couldn't go forward with it. And so we did a 6-month extension of the existing contract, which was at higher rates with less money going to the state. And in the interim, we said, okay, what are we supposed to do? what is our procurement supposed to look like now that we cannot go forward with this? And we couldn't get an answer. So we did a second 6-month extension and said, what are we supposed to do? And didn't get an answer. So we did a third 6-month extension. All these going to the Board of Public Works for them to approve these extensions. And at least by the third time, the answer was the goal now is not to maximize the amount of money made through this contract. The goal is to start stepping down the amount of money that was to be paid under this contract, so that by the third or fourth year of the contract, the commission rate is down to something like 20% or something like that. So instead of what the initial procurement was to award was based upon the maximum return to the state, we then went out with a procurement that was supposed to not only take into consideration how much revenue was coming into the state, but give more consideration for the cost to the end recipient of the phone calls, who ultimately were going to be the ones footing that commission paid to the state. And so finally, when we got the specific direction of what we were supposed to do, we did a new procurement and it got awarded. And now let me give you a little more of the background. The focus of the opposition was the cost of phone calls to inmates and their families. Now, prisoners in prisons, they're usually there because they do bad things. And you probably have read in the paper, you've probably heard on the television, etc., of instances where people in prison had arranged for hits on witnesses and things like that, or continued to operate drug rings out of prisons, etc. And that's more of a problem now with cell phones, and it wasn't so much about cell phones back in 2000, 2001, but there was still an issue that the prisoners had to have the ability to make phone calls, but you had to put restrictions on those phone calls so you could know who they're calling, what they were saying to them, and things of many nature. And so the requirements were that there were very, very stringent restrictions on the vendor that provided this service on what kind of phone calls they could even allow to be completed. And it was expensive to put the equipment in place to do this type of restriction and monitoring. And so the first time this was procured, it was with that the cost of the call had to be enough to pay for the contract itself. And then as more and more services wanted to be delivered to the inmates, and as more and more cuts happened in the funding, it started adding this revenue generating aspect to it. So it's not only pay for the restrictions, but give us some revenue besides. And the way that they did this was by the company that had this contract had to make it so the only way a prisoner could make a phone call was as a collect call. That way, with a collect call, you had to have an operator place the call. You couldn't dial direct. And an operator-assisted call is more expensive than a direct dialed call. And since it's a collect call, the person receiving the call has to pay for it. And what that typically meant is the family of the inmate was the one receiving the collect call, who on their phone bill, if they got 10 calls in a month from their relative, their son, daughter, husband, whoever, excuse me, and each of them, I think, started out as something like $3 for the first minute, and then was 50 cents or something like a minute thereafter. So they might have $50 or $100 a month in charges for calls just to be able to talk to their loved one that was in prison. And a lot of times these are people with low income, and so a $50 a month charge was something that was difficult. And sometimes what supposedly the situation was that some of the people had to decline the collect call because they couldn't afford to pay for it when it actually came in the bill. And this is all that the advocacy group is saying. You shouldn't provide services to inmates by transferring the cost to the backs of the family of the inmates, etc., which you got to admit is not something that we want to be in the position to say, yep, we make poor mother or dad or whoever pay for the call just so the state can make some money, even though all the money that came in from the commissions went to what's called the Inmate Welfare Fund to pay for them having various types of amenities, various types of recreational activities, etc. that used to be paid for by the state but were being transferred to the inmate welfare fund. So that's the scenario, and bottom line is we didn't go forward. We had the 18 months extensions, finally had to do it a different way. It was something that I don't want to go through again. So it's a very unusual situation, but it's up here to illustrate sometimes unusual situations happen. So there was an avowed opponent, and that avowed opponent got heard. It got in the Sun paper. It didn't get approved, had to do it over again, did it over this time with a whole different objective, not maximize money, but minimize cost. So, one example. Yes?
In that particular instance, how would you monitor the commissions?
How do you monitor the commission?
Right, unless you're following the person emptying the coins out of the coins, how would you know?
There were no coins. What each inmate had a card, and that card was unique to the inmate, so you knew whose inmate card was being used. There was no money, because this was, I remember to a degree the specifications. It specified what the phone instrument had to be like, because basically it had to withstand someone taking a stool and beating on it, because prisoners at times act out, and you couldn't have anything that could be broken off, that could potentially be used as a weapon. There was something about the cord. The cord could not be, so it could be removed and used to apply around someone's neck. I mean, things I would never think of were in these specifications. And part of it was it had to be card, so each inmate had a sort of like the residents at the facilities. They have their resident fund, and they have a certain amount of money each month that they're allowed to use to buy things, etc. So public safety would keep an account for each inmate, how much money they had, and they would load the card with a certain amount of well, they wouldn't load it because actually it was collect call. But they would restrict the card to know who was calling, and each inmate was only allowed to call 10 numbers that had to be programmed in advance. And it had to be validated who those numbers were. Their lawyer, their family, and I don't know if it was restricted just to those two types of activities. But a lot of restrictions, and no coins. Okay, moving on. What's the conclusion? Even though everything was done to make sure the procurement should proceed despite the opposition of the advocacy group, that's what I said initially when we went to the Secretary of Public Safety, ended up as failed procurement. All the extensive time and effort devoted to this by state personnel at DBM and Public Safety, and the cost of offerers was wasted because it was a failed procurement. If we could have avoided it, we would have avoided it. And you should avoid things. You should avoid everything you shouldn't do in the future. Remember that. If you shouldn't do it, don't do it. And remember, you heard it from me. And this is just a little more detail if you want to read a little more detail. Here's another example of a procurement that happened but didn't happen. PBIS, Personnel and Benefits Information System, that you've never heard of before because it never happened. The intent back in around 1999, was that this PBIS was supposed to automate salary administration, position classification, employee development and training, employee relations, recruitment and examination, labor relations, employee benefits, time entry, and medical director activities. Just a few little things it was supposed to take care of. These functions were to be provided to, at that time, 75,000 active state employees for most of the activities, and about 130,000 state employees, retirees, dependents, etc., for the employee benefits, so your health plans, your pharmacy plan, dental plan, etc. The estimated cost in 2000, and this was a rough estimate, was $50 to $70 million. Except I will tell you, since I went through this, that the consultant that we were using said many times, don't be surprised if it's a lot higher than 70 million. But the official published cost estimate was 50 to 70 million. Okay, just a little bit of change. something we have casually laying around. So it was decided that the state needed to have this advanced personnel benefits information system. And it was decided that before we could have this, we needed to go out and do a contract to get a vendor to help us do this follow-up activity. So we had a first stage procurement, which was done in 1999. And actually, if any of you attend the class that we're giving on competitive sealed proposals, we use the results of this procurement in the sealed proposal class to show you how to arrive at the most advantageous offerer. And this procurement was done in '99, and what the vendor who won this first contract was supposed to do was to go out to all the state agencies and first of all find out what did they have in place to take care of those 10 or 12 different things that I listed a couple slides ago. Did they have IT systems that they had done on their own to take care of these situations? Because for the most part, every agency had gone out and created something to handle its own needs. And so, first issue, if you want to create a statewide information system, you have to find out what's out there, what business rules are out there, what has to be satisfied, and what has to be integrated to be able to proceed. So most of the effort was find out what's in place, and then we wanted the contractor to help us write the specifications to get the vendor to actually implement a PBIS. We wanted them to assist us in evaluating the offerers and making the award, and then we wanted that vendor to actually help us monitor the performance of the vendor. And the one thing we said in the specifications is the last bullet, the vendor who won this first stage was barred from bidding on the second stage contract. Since they were writing the specifications, we couldn't let them bid on the specifications they were writing. That's a violation of the state ethics provision.
Could you have said that I don't want to bid on the second stage, I'll bid when you ask for a contract, let somebody else do the...
Oh, that was the issue. One of the issues was, well, if you say right up front that if you win this first procurement, you cannot participate in the second procurement. Okay. And you'll look at this thing. The contract value was $2.5 million. Now, the slide before said 50 to 70 million. 2.5, 70. 2.5, 70. Which one do I want to go after? And so the question we had to decide is, will there be enough vendors out there that are interested in the relatively small piece that they will pass up on the large piece? And our decision was there were, because there were a lot of vendors that could do consulting activity that never would have the capability to actually implement a $70 million project. And we did end up with 10 vendors responding. So we made an award in '99 for $2.5 million for a contractor to do these activities. The RFP for the second stage contract was issued, and I'm not sure exactly what the significance of this is, but for some reason I thought it was significant, on Halloween of 2000. Maybe it's because it had a frightful conclusion. I knew I was going to work something in there about Halloween. The proposals were due in January 2001, so we were given more than 2 months for the vendors to respond to this procurement. And in March 2001, after about 6 weeks of evaluating the proposals, having vendors in for discussions, having demonstrations of their projects, the decision was to pull the plug. What the decision was, let me see, it was decided that what was specified was too cutting edge. It would have been the most comprehensive application of this nature in the country. We didn't know we were going to be out there on, sometimes they call it the cutting edge, sometimes they call it the bleeding edge. So we were going to be out there in the forefront of making this work, proving it either did work or didn't work for the rest of the country. It would have been the most comprehensive. It would be, it said most existing PBIS applications only did a few of the functions that were identified several slides ago and did it for fewer employees. So we definitely were stretching the envelope. The assessment of the evaluation committee and of the other people involved in this was that even with the foremost vendors in the field responding, and we did get the big hitters in this area, because 70 million, cutting edge, yes, they want to respond. But the decision was that the risk of failure was too great. That instead of, normally when you go through discussions and demonstrations, you have questions and the expectation is the vendors are going to answer those questions. They're going to dispel your fears. They're going to make you feel better that things are going to work out. But in this situation, as they went along and asked questions and got responses and had demonstrations, that the demonstrations didn't work. And then, well, okay, give me a second chance. And you give them a second chance. And the second demonstration doesn't work. And so you ask questions, and the questions don't answer anything succinctly. So instead of things seeming to get better, with everything that was asked and everything that was demonstrated, all it kept doing was compounding the fact that it doesn't seem like there's anything out there that's going to do what we want. It doesn't seem like there's anything that's going to work. And so if we don't have confidence that we can get a contract delivered that's going to work, is there any sense in making an award to try to get it to work if it doesn't seem like it's going to? And the obvious answer under that scenario is no. If it doesn't seem like it's going to work, don't just try again. And another compounding issue that was very significant was this one. Right towards the end of the evaluation process, the state's chief information officer, who was the terminology that's used is the champion of the project, suddenly resigned from the state and went to work for Montgomery County as the chief information officer for Montgomery County at higher pay. And so when you don't have the champion, the person who was going to be the contract manager, the person who was, I don't know, perhaps the single biggest driver of this thing, that along with the other circumstances just said, we don't want to continue down this road. And some other considerations. Number one, you had the potential cost. Number two, in 1994, just 7 years prior to this, all of you know and love FMIS, right? Financial Management Information System that we all started using in 1994. And we know there's a STARS component, we know there's an ADPICS component, and there was supposed to be a human resources component back in 94. And after spending about $2 million on that component, the plug was pulled because it didn't work. And most of the money we got back from the vendor, but not all of it. So we had already one failed situation of trying to implement, trying to automate a human resources application. Standard issue, the third bullet. Most large IT projects fail. And the corollary is the bigger the project, the more likely it's going to fail. And even though 70 million isn't big by federal standards, 70 million certainly was big by most other standards. So it was a big project which had a high risk factor to begin with. Then there was another complication, as if the first three weren't enough. 2000, August in 2000, so that's just a year before we were going through this. Not even a year before we're going through this. Washington, D.C. had a $20 million system that they had spent 9 years trying to implement. $20 million, 9 years. In August of 2000, they pulled the plug and abandoned the project. So against 70 million, we already had one failed smaller scope. It was IT. Washington, D.C. just had a failed procurement that we're going to look at in a couple slides. And we decided to err on the side of caution and cancel the procurement. We rejected all offers and just canceled the procurement and didn't do it because of the risk factor. The 2.5 million did go to good benefit. It was used for various things, task orders that were done under CATS and TSP and things of that nature. So we got our money from the first vendor for what the efforts they put that we paid $2.5 million for. And a lot of the stuff that would have been done through a contractor was done with state personnel, state IT people, or under task orders. So it wasn't all a complete loss. The decision, and I think I want to emphasize, because if you think about it, the decision to cancel this procurement came while there was a procurement. That meant that it's in the procure phase and not the planning phase. And our class right now is planning. So what does something that was done in the procure phase have to do with planning? And it's very simple. During planning, a number of go, no-go points were established. In planning, we decided that at various points we were going to stop and re-examine, should we go forward? And one of the points that was established in the planning phase was specifically at the evaluation. And it was decided that unless everything was indicated that it was going to work, we already had agreed we were going to cancel it if everything was not positive. So in planning, it was agreed. And I will tell you, you seem to like my stories. I have stories. I will remember in October of 2000, for 2 days, one of them being Columbus Day, that is supposed to be a state holiday, I was one of 16 people that were basically sequestered in a room at the State Highway Administration complex in Hanover from around 8 o'clock in the morning to 5 o'clock in the evening, going through what was allegedly the final version of the specifications before we issued them. And we were going through all the specifications section by section, and the 16 people included a couple people from procurement, a couple people from legal, a number of people from the IT section, a lot of people from the employee benefits and the personnel part of DBM, and a number of people from the contractor, the first phase contractor. So 16 people in a big room going through, we each had a copy of the draft specifications section by section. And I can remember that most of the time you're going through and there's issues that are raised and we make decisions, okay, we'll do this, we'll change this language, etc. But a couple times in those 2 days, there issues were raised that it was not a simple, well, here's what we'll do and we'll get this corrected and move on. It was, and I remember one in particular towards the end of the first day, something was thrown out there as a possible impediment. And when it was thrown out there, and the personnel people, and in particular the IT people, started basically discussing back and forth about, well, here's what we need, well, here's what we can do. Well, what you can do isn't what we need. Well, we can't do what you need. And so at times it got a little bit heated. For 20 minutes or a half hour, they went back and forth, and frankly, by the end of the first day, I thought we never were going to go forward and issue the solicitation. I thought it had been, an impasse had been identified, that it was already decided that we couldn't get what we wanted just from the get-go. And so it was, okay, let's think about it tonight, let's come back tomorrow, and let's see if tomorrow we can, since we've already spent $2.5 million, since we've already invested a whole lot of time and effort, so if we really want something to happen, tomorrow when we're fresher, maybe we can think of some way around this seeming impasse. And in fact, the next day, they did think of something to do that resolved the issue. But they came a number of times to, all right, now if when we're in the procurement, we see this result, we need to say right now we're going to pull the plug. And so there were like 3, 4, 5 different places where it was agreed, if this happens, we're going to go forward. If this happens, we're not going to go forward. And that's part of planning. If you have something like this, you can make those decisions in the planning stage so that if it happens in the procure stage, you don't have to then sit down and spend days trying to figure out what to do about it. You've already decided what to do about it. And the decision when we made it in procure didn't take long. It took all of a couple hours to, okay, we think we ought to just cancel this. Just make sure the secretary is okay with it. Secretary talks to the people involved. They convince her that, yep, this isn't going to work. Okay, cancel it. Because all the preliminary work was done in the planning stage. So here was a procurement, again, where it was decided the risk of continuing was higher than the risk of not continuing. And we made some of those decisions in the planning stage. The important point of this example is that we shouldn't contract at any cost. We should take all reasonable steps to ensure that a procurement will likely deliver what we expect, reasonably ensure that the vendor picked to perform under contract can and will perform as required. Part of the due diligence should be the anticipation during the planning stage of potential pitfalls and what to do about them if they occur. By doing this, decision-making in the procurement and contract performance stages becomes easier. Pay me now, pay me later. And I will mention this, then we'll probably take a break. Example, I mentioned the Washington, D.C. payroll system. So this was taken as excerpts from the Washington Post at that time. And this resonated with me at that time. It still resonates with me. And it just validates some of the things we've been saying and some of the things that hopefully we don't become the same type of poster child for non-performance as this example. So Washington, D.C., payroll system contract. They started it in 1991. They worked on it for 9 years, from 1991 to 2000. In those 9 years, they spent $20 million trying to implement this payroll system. And in August of 2000, they scrapped it and went back to what they had when they started, i.e. what was in place in 1991. But what was in place in 1991 originally went in place in 1983. So by the time in 2000 that they went back to using it, it was now an 18-year-old system. And in addition to spending $20 million for something that basically they threw up their hands and just had spent money with no benefit, it cost them $5.6 million to go back and make enough adaptations to the old system that they could use it again. So we're talking about $26 million and a whole lot of, and that's just what they paid the contractor for something just to validate that it didn't work. And so why did that happen? And again, this is quoted from the Washington Post. The auditor said that the city did not even keep a central file of documents related to the system, including contracts and a history of decision. One of the things they wanted to know when this thing went belly up is, did they have any recourse against the contractor? Did the contractor not perform as per the contract so we can get some money back? But gee, we couldn't find a contract. Or we found a contract that might have been there in day one, but it's been changed 217 times since that, and we don't know what it's been changed to. So we don't know what the contractor was contractually obligated to do. And since we couldn't find anything, we being the DC auditors, you couldn't go against the vendor for anything for non-performance if you can't find out what the required performance was. What were they authorized to do? What were they not authorized to do? What were they required to do? There wasn't anything there. And continuing with the quote, the project was mismanaged by the city as well as the contractor. And it was just a long story of not having the right people inside to manage the contract and not having the right contractor. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize if you don't have the right vendor and you don't have anybody looking over their shoulder to begin with, you're not going to get what you want unless it happens by the miracle, luck, etc. And in this case, it didn't. The complexity of customizing a payroll system to those schedules. They supposedly had 280 different payroll schedules. And rules renders any system useless, continuing with the quote. The city must simplify its pay schedules. Until this is done, no off-the-shelf system can be used. It will probably take up to 5 years to negotiate a simpler set of work rules and determine a new computer system requirements. So this is what $26 million spent, another 5 years before we can do it again, and here's the woes of why it went that way. And we're supposed to not have that happen in our procurements. Yes?
They're still using that one that was put back in place in 91?
To tell you the truth, I haven't the faintest idea. This was happening at the time we constructed this class back in 2001, and I haven't tried to follow up since then. So I would hope not, but I don't know. I just love these quotes. Not that you ever should read these quotes, but it just tells the story. And like I say, if you're not going to manage it, you've already lost the battle. So why don't you, an example of procurement probably shouldn't have been done because of lack of failure, demonstrated the wisdom of canceling PBIS procurement, and we had this as already an example of the bad things that can happen since this happened 6 months before we canceled our procurement, and what can happen without proper contract management. And, all right, so why don't we take a break, come back in 15 minutes, and we'll start with some other issues of risk assessment.